In our first two segments of Quick and Dirty School Finance, we talked about how money gets into the state system. In this segment, we'll talk about how that money flows out of the state system to local school districts and how local tax revenues and state revenues relate to one another, really kind of mix together in the overall system of school finance. Before we do that, I want you to think a little bit about how you get paid or how a teacher gets paid in your local school district. At the end of the month or at the end of the pay period, teachers receive a check or a direct deposit for the total amount of money that's due to them. Sometimes that funding will be made up of their base salary plus any extra duty stipends that they might have for things that they do above and beyond their regular teaching duties. Well, the state funding system works pretty much the same way. There's base funding based pretty much on the number of students you have attending school in your district. And then there's funding that comes from the state for extra effort that your district makes to raise revenues at the local level. Let's look at how both of them work. That base funding is called Tier 1, and it is a basic allotment of $4,675 per year per student. So to start with, the state says we're going to send to every school district in the state for the coming year $4,675 per student based on how often they come to school. It's based on your average daily attendance, which is the sum of all of the students in attendance every day divided by the number of instructional days in the school year. They want to encourage students to come to school and encourage districts to make sure students are coming to school. So they don't send the money based on just whether or not a student is enrolled. They send the money based on whether or not students are making the effort to come to school and school districts are making the effort to keep them there. So $4,675 per kid. Then the state says not all students are equal and not all districts are equal. They all have different special circumstances. So when it comes to distributing that money, they actually distribute the funds in the basic allotment based on weighted ADA. That's where the state says, okay, $4,675 per kid, but we'll give you additional funding if the students have some special circumstances or if the district has some special circumstances. All of those factors are looked at together to create a figure that's called weighted ADA or WADA. And that $4,675 per WADA is what makes up the base funding that comes to a school district each year. Now the extra effort stipend, Tier 2, sort of like the extra duty stipend that a teacher might make above his or her base salary, well, that's based on local tax effort. How much your school board and your voters might be willing to raise in property taxes at the local level. Now, the property taxes that are levied at the local level, they raise funds for the school district based on the wealth of the property in the district. So what the state says is, if you raise your tax rate, you'll get more money at the local level, but we'll be willing to kick in more money from the state level if you put in the extra effort to raise as much as you can at the local level. Here's how it works. Every penny over $1 on the tax rate earns some additional revenue from the state. To encourage school districts to raise that tax rate, the first few pennies are actually able to generate more state revenue than the last few pennies. Those first few pennies, $1, $2, $3, $4, $6, we call those golden pennies because they generate more revenue from the state under the formula that the state has than the second group of pennies, $7, $8, $9, all the way up to $17. Those are called copper pennies because they generate additional state revenue, just not as much. Now remember from previous discussions, legally a school board can raise the tax rate up to $1.04. Beyond that, the school board has to go to the voters in an election. So let's look at an example of how this all works. Fantasy ISD. Fantasy ISD has an M&O tax rate of $1.04, and their WADA is $2,000. So how do their tier 1 funds get computed? Well, remember the basic allotment is $4,675 per WADA per year. So $4,765 times 2,000, that's their WADA, and the amount is $9,530,000. So Fantasy ISD would receive $9,530,000 in state aid for Tier 1. Because their tax rate is over $1, they've gone up to $1.04, they get Tier 2 funds. Tier 2 funds are worth $57.95 per penny per WADA. So in Fantasy ISD, $57.95 times 4 pennies, $1, $2, $3, $4, each of those gets $57.95 times the number of pennies above the minimum tax rate times WADA, 2,000. That number is $463,600. So because they've raised their tax rate to $1.04, in addition to what that generates at the local level, the state is going to send Fantasy ISD $463,600. When you combine their Tier 1 and Tier 2 funding together, in state aid under Tier 1 and Tier 2 in the Foundation School Program, Fantasy ISD would get from the state $9,993,600. Now, these examples are simplified. They don't account for other variations in state aid. There are some additional sources in funding that come from the state, but this is presented so that you can understand conceptually how Tier 1 and Tier 2 funding work in a district. Let's look at another district that has a different set of circumstances. Nova ISD. Their M&O tax rate is $1.08, and their WADA is $600. It's a very small school district. So their Tier 1 funds would be computed the same way as they were in Fantasy ISD. $4,765, that's the basic allotment, times 600, that's their WADA in Nova. That generates $2,859,000. Their Tier 2 funds are going to be computed a little differently because their tax rate is $1.08. And the first 6 pennies above $1 generate one level of state revenue, the golden pennies, and then any pennies above $1.06 do generate additional state revenue but at a lower rate. The going rate for golden pennies is $57.95, just like we saw in the first example. And so Nova ISD gets credit for 6 golden pennies. $57.95 times 6 times their WADA, 600. That generates $208,620 additional dollars based on their golden pennies in Tier 2. And then they have 2 more pennies because their tax rate's $1.08. So the penny from $1.07 and the penny from $1.08, those generate additional state revenue at the copper penny rate, and that's $31.95 per penny per WADA. $31.95 times 2 pennies times 600 WADA equals $38,340. So when you combine their Tier 1 funds and their Tier 2 funds from their golden pennies and their copper pennies, Nova ISD will receive $3,105,960. Now remember again, this is a simplified example so that you can understand the concept of Tier 1 and Tier 2. In our next video, we'll look at how the school finance structure attempts to equalize funding across districts with different levels of wealth per student. Really, how we take from the rich and we give to the poor.